Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Midday Report here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Cato. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has announced a reshuffle of his cabinet in an effort to quell the turmoil caused by the coalition's loss of this year's presidential election. The cabinet has been trimmed down from 26 to 21 ministers.
One of the ministers to remain in his post is Radosław Sikorski. The foreign minister, however, has also been appointed deputy prime minister. The Ministry of Justice will be led by Waldemar Żurek. The former judge has made a name for himself by vocally criticizing the judicial reforms introduced by the previous right-wing government. He replaces Adam Bodnar. Marcin Kierwiński, who was the main government coordinator for the response to last year's flood crisis, has been appointed interior minister. His predecessor, Tomasz Siemoniak, will remain coordinator of the security services. Andrzej Domański's role has been expanded, with economy added to his finance portfolio. The Ministry of Finance and Economy is one of two newly created so-called super-ministries. The other is the Ministry of Energy, that merges elements of the environment, industry and climate ministries. That ministry will be led by Miłosz Motyka, who rose from being Deputy Prime Minister for Climate. Other ministries that come under new leadership include those for health, state assets and culture.
At least 2 civilians have been killed and 30 others, including children, were wounded in Russian attacks across Ukraine over the past 24 hours. The Ukrainian Air Force reports that Russia launched 71 attack and decoy drones overnight Tuesday, targeting multiple regions of the country. Ukraine's air defense says its systems intercepted 27 drones across northern, eastern and central areas, while electronic warfare downed an additional 18. The greatest destruction was reported in the Sumy, Kharkiv, Kherson and Donetsk regions. The attacks damaged residential buildings, schools, hospitals and shops. Power outages also followed, affecting many areas across the country. Political turmoil and unrest continues in Ukraine after President Volodymyr Zelenskyy signed into law a bill that grants the Prosecutor General new powers over anti-corruption investigations. According to opposition lawmakers and watchdog organizations, the bill effectively destroys the independence of Ukraine's two key anti-corruption bodies.
The new bill grants the Prosecutors General power over investigations led by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and cases led by the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. From now on, the Prosecutor General will have the authority to issue directions and investigations and even reassign them to external agencies. Moreover, under the new bill, the Prosecutor General will have powers to close investigations at the request of the defense. The introduction of the law resulted in mass protests in the Ukrainian capital. According to the protesters, the bill will destroy the independence of the two anti-corruption institutions. Similar protests are expected to also take place today. The issue was addressed by Transparency International Ukraine. According to the organization, with the adoption of the new law, Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian MPs are destroying a decade of progress in anti-corruption reforms.
In an interview with TVP World, Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko sharply criticized the Ukrainian government for curbing anti-corruption agencies. According to Goncharenko, the move is an undemocratic, non-European power grab orchestrated by President Zelenskyy.
It's a betrayal of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and it's not somewhat controversial. It's absolutely catastrophic bill, which Zelenskyy not just signed, but he prepared it, organized its voting in the parliament, and then signed it just in hours. And despite the fact that people came to the streets for the first time from the start of Russian full-scale invasion, because it's absolutely unacceptable. Unfortunately, Zelenskyy made his choice, and his choice is to build an autocratic country where he has complete control over everything. It's not democracy, it's not European way, it's something different. And it's very painful to see such development, especially at the moment when Russia is attacking us from outside. But this is an attack from inside.
Ukrainian lawmakers have begun collecting signatures to file a motion to the Constitutional Court challenging the law that strips independence from the country's two anti-corruption institutions. According to an MP from the opposition Holos Party, Jarosław Żelezniak, the only thing that can now be done to remedy the situation for the law to be struck down by the Constitutional Court.
According to Zelenskyy, the way the bill passes through the Ukrainian parliament violated procedural rules. Additionally, he expressed hope that the international reaction might help reverse the legislation. The motion to put the bill on the agenda of Ukraine's Constitutional Court will require at least 45 signatures from members of parliament. In Ukraine, a group of lawmakers or their president can formally challenge the legality of a law by asking the court to assess if it complies with the constitution. If the court rules that the law violates the Ukrainian constitution, it will be struck down in part or in full.
President Zelenskyy held a meeting on Wednesday with the heads of the Ukrainian law enforcement and anti-corruption agencies to establish a common strategy for combating corruption. The meeting took place amid widespread protests against the government crackdown on Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies.
We all hear what society has to say. We see what people expect from state institutions to ensure fairness and efficiency of each institution. We discussed the necessary administrative and legislative decisions that will strengthen the work of each institution, resolve existing contradictions, and remove threats. Everyone will work together, and we will support them at the political level. We agreed that next week we will have an in-depth working meeting on a common action plan, and in 2 weeks a joint plan should be ready. What steps are needed and will be implemented to strengthen Ukraine and resolve existing issues, provide more justice, and protect the interests of Ukrainian society.
Ukraine is a candidate country, meaning they're a partner to us, and we, the European Union, will do everything to make Ukraine strong under this European path, said Marta Kos, European Commissioner for Enlargement, while discussing the recent political developments in Ukraine with TVP World. According to Kos, the latest moves by the Ukrainian government undermine the independence of the country's anti-corruption bodies. The Commissioner also stressed that the EU will be discussing the new legislation with Ukraine's government and will find solutions during the EU accession process.
Ukraine is a candidate country, meaning this is a partner to us. And we, the European Union, will do everything that Ukraine will be strong under this European path. Of course, something like this can happen. Fighting the corruption is very much important. So we will discuss this with the government of Ukraine. And I'm sure that during the accession process, during the negotiations, we will find the solutions also for this very important question. Why is this so important? Fighting the corruption means that if there is really independent institutions which are fighting the corruption, we give the certainty, the legal certainty to possible investors. We also give the certainty to the member states that once Ukraine will finish the negotiations, we will get a very, very good new member state.
Delegations from the Kremlin and Kyiv have arrived in Turkey to take part in the first peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in nearly 2 months. The talks are scheduled to take place later today in Istanbul.
The upcoming talks in Istanbul are the first since 2 rounds held in May and early June. While those talks led to multiple prisoner exchanges, no ceasefire was agreed upon despite calls from the United States for one. In fact, Russia has since only increased the intensity of its drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian civilians. Over the weekend, Ukraine called for new negotiations. While the Kremlin agreed, there have been no indications that Russian President Vladimir Putin is prepared to reconsider his goal of the capitulation of Ukraine.
Russia is moving toward a year-round draft as it faces mounting losses in Ukraine. A new bill introduced by the Duma on Tuesday aims to expand Russia's seasonal military mobilization into a continuous year-long effort. This comes as Russian forces have suffered over 1 million casualties since the beginning of its invasion of Ukraine. If passed, the law would allow the Russian government to draft citizens throughout the year, with conscription still occurring during 2 main periods from April to July and October to December. The bill, which was developed under Vladimir Putin's directive, aims to streamline the process and ensure a constant flow of troops to the front lines. This move comes as Russia grapples with significant military losses in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian General Staff reporting that Russia has lost over 1 million troops since the start of its full-scale invasion. The number of Russian military personnel killed is now nearing 120,000, with independent Russian outlets such as Mediazona confirming the identities of many of the fallen. The EU-Japan summit has wrapped up in Tokyo with promises made to strengthen defense and trade. The assurances between the bloc and the powerhouse East Asian nation comes as relations across the Atlantic have only become more torrid. Our EU correspondent Angela Skujins has been following this summit from Brussels. Good afternoon, Angela. What has been promised from these talks?
Yes, so a lot of motherhood statements in the 29 conclusions that came out of the summit in Tokyo, the most significant of being on security and defence as well as trade. Now, in the conclusions, it states that the EU and Tokyo will work on developing a security and defence partnership. Now, this is important because this is the first step to developing a security and defence pact, which would allow Japan to procure weapons, supplying them to the EU member states as part of that €800 billion rearm Europe push. Now, the other piece of the puzzle here being trade. One of those conclusions mentions that both Brussels and Tokyo want to work on stamping out unfair trade practices, as well as diversifying and shoring up the supply of critical raw materials. And despite 9,500 kilometres separating both of these capitals, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says they have quite a bit in common.
We are facing rising pressure on two main fronts. The first is geoeconomics, with growing trade tensions and uncertainty, fragile supply chains, the challenge of overcapacity and unleveled playing fields. And on the other hand, geopolitics, with rising threats to our shared stability and interests, from the battlefields in Ukraine to the waters of the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, so what role does Washington have to play in this? You could argue that the long shadow of US President Donald Trump has virtually loomed large across all of the meetings the EU has had with shoring up its bilateral relations. This was particularly paramount as news broke last night that Japan and the US had struck a tariff deal. And while we pore over the details of that, we know that ambassadors and capitals in Europe, particularly Germany, are furious over the way the European Commission has handled their own trade negotiating efforts. We also know that that 30% tariff threat spearheaded by US President Donald Trump will come into effect on the 1st of August if no deal is brokered. But the news that we're gathering is that the European Commission plans on presenting a plan to those EU heads of state, which would target 93 billion euros worth of US goods. Ambassadors are also expected to get an update here in the Belgian capital today. But the charm offensive from the EU continues, with those top Brussels brass travelling to Beijing tomorrow for what is billed to be a low-stakes, low-expectation affair.
Thank you so much, Angela Skujins, reporting from Brussels on the EU-Japan summit. Now, Greek authorities have arrested Moldovan oligarch Vladimir Plahotniuc, who is suspected of defrauding banks of over $1 billion. Plahotniuc was put on Interpol's wanted list in February this year and was subject to US and UK sanctions over alleged corruption and efforts to legally influence Moldovan elections.
Following Plahotniuc's arrest at Athens' Eleftherios Venizelos International Airport, the Greek police entered the premises of his house in the Athenian suburbs. Their officers found 17 forged passports from multiple different countries, over 150,000 euros in cash, encoded USB and SSD drives, as well as multiple cell phones and computers. In addition to allegations of financial crimes, Plahotniuc faced accusations in Moldova of undermining the judiciary and media, all while being involved in a Russian attempt to destabilize Moldovan politics.
And that wraps up Midday Report. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for more on TVP World. Good night.